Okay, I think we'll get started with the second part of this evening's proceedings. Welcome everyone to this very special public lecture. My name is Tom Pegram. I'm the director of the Policy Institute here at Trinity College Dublin. So the mission of the Policy Institute is to really promote informed debate around pressing social, political, economic issues that we confront today in Ireland and indeed the world. And I don't think we could think of a more important issue than the topic of this evening's lecture, which is women in politics. And around the globe, we see increasingly women taking high office. A quick Google reveals that it's actually Latin America which leads the way in absolute numbers of female presidents and prime ministers. However, the limits of gender equality in political life are not hard to find. For instance, we might look at the hair and costume commentary that often accompanies serious analysis of leadership style, of policies, or women politicians. Closer to home, as we will, I'm sure, get into in great detail, in Ireland, of course, here we boast two former female presidents, Mary McAleese, Mary Robinson, but the country currently ranks 25th out of 27 European countries for female political representation, with just 26 of 166 political representatives being women. In the global league tables, Ireland finds itself in rather extraordinary company. Right down there at 85th place, it has a worse record than Uzbekistan, than Iraq, than Afghanistan. President Michael D. Higgins recently called for more women to enter politics, and strongly criticised what he termed simple concessions of participation in a male, patriarchal and authoritarian setting. Are gender quotas the solution? Michel Lagarde, the current director of the IMF, thinks they are. So what is going on here then? What are the challenges that women face in political life? Are they being excluded from the political process? Is there, if you will, some kind of stealth discrimination at work? And to use an analogy, how do they select the symphony orchestras in Berlin, in Vienna, in Boston today? Well, there's a screen between the musician and the jury. And what do we find? Well, the number of women in those orchestras has gone up by between 30 and 50% since the 1970s. So the juries were not listening to the music. So to help us shed some light on these questions, of course, gender representation is not an issue on this platform this evening. We're extremely fortunate to be joined by three very high-profile speakers with real insight, academic, political, and personal, into the experience of women in political life. What might explain their underrepresentation? How might this situation be addressed moving forwards? I'm going to leave the formal introductions to Dr. Catherine Lawless, the director of the Gender and Women's Centre here at Trinity, who's very kindly agreed to chair this evening's proceedings. So just to say, do please keep an eye out for future Policy Institute events. It's great to have you all here this evening. I'd also convey my congratulations to the Dermot McAleese Teaching Award recipients. I'm also under an obligation to just quickly point out that if we do have an emergency, ladies and gentlemen, please proceed immediately to the nearest exits, which are there and there. So, without further ado, I will give the floor to Catherine. Thanks very much.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me to chair this evening. And just to give you an idea into the structure of the evening, we're going to have two papers first from Professor Gail McElroy, followed by Rachel Nolan, and then this will be followed by a response from Professor Ivana Bacik. So just to introduce the speakers, Professor Gail McElroy will speak on Where Are All the Women? The Political Ambition Gap in Irish Public Life. She is Professor of Political Science at Trinity College Dublin. Her primary research interests are in the field of legislative behaviour and party politics. Recent publications have dealt with the nature of party competition in the European Parliament, the role of committees in the policy process, and the quality of citizen representation in the European Union. She is also actively involved in the Irish National Election Study and the Irish Candidate Study, and recent publishing work in this area explores the continued underrepresentation of women in Irish politics. She's currently working on an Irish Research Council funded project which examines the differences in political ambition amongst Irish men and women. She's a graduate of TCD, the London School of Economics, and the University of Rochester. I'm going to introduce all three to you at the moment, so I won't be leaping up and down over to the podium like a jack-in-the-box. So if I might go on to introduce Ms. Rachel Nolan, who will speak on political life, what it's like on the inside. Rachel Nolan served as an MP for 11 years, including 3 as senior minister in a robust parliamentary environment. Having started as a young woman and gone on to hold significant economic portfolios, Rachel will reflect on the personal experience of elected office. She's a former MP and Cabinet Minister from Queensland, Australia, and those portfolios were finance, natural resources, transport and arts in the government of Queensland's first woman Premier, Anna Bligh. She was elected to Parliament at the age of 26, making her the youngest woman ever elected to State Parliament at that time. Her academic background is in government and economics, and in 2006 she was named the University of Queensland's Young Alumnus of the Year. While in Parliament, she served on the University of Queensland Senate and the board of the leading think tank, the Brisbane Institute. She remains an active runner and cyclist and won a major national award for contribution to cycling by a politician. Well, Professor Ivana Bacik is the Reed Professor of Criminal Law, Criminology and Penology, fellow of Trinity College Dublin and a practicing barrister. She's Director of Undergraduate Teaching and Learning in the School of Law, Trinity College Dublin. She has a law degree from Trinity College Dublin and an LLM from the London School of Economics. Her research interests include criminal law and criminology, constitutional law, feminist theories in law, human rights and equality issues in law. She was elected to the Seanad in 2007. And I'm very pleased to be on this panel with her this evening because I remember her as one of the most outstanding student union presidents that we ever had. So without further ado, now I'll hand you over to Professor Gail.
Thank you, Catherine. I'm very pleased to be here this evening. I should stay near this microphone, I imagine, because it's being podcast. If I start wandering, wave at me from the back. I wandered into this topic a number of years ago at the behest of a colleague, Michael Marsh. It's different from my original research interests, but the study has blossomed in recent years. I'm going to give you an overview of what we found. When we originally started it, we had an interesting question in the Irish National Election Study on, women voters, and we thought, if you read the Irish Times, letter pages, you always find this kind of conventional wisdom that there's so few women in Irish politics because Irish women won't vote for women. And we decided to explore this, and we went kind of backwards and forwards and did pyrotechnics with the data, and I'll save you the punchline, but Irish voters are actually gender neutral. So this really isn't the explanation for why there are so few women in the Dáil, and we'll look at kind of other explanations over the course of the next 20 or 25 minutes. So Tom touched on this, and it's well rehearsed, that these are the European Union countries. You had it as the second or third lowest, I have it the fourth lowest, depends on what year you're looking at. We're kind of in, this is, the representation of women in the Irish Parliament, about 15% typically. And only, countries like Hungary and Malta have lower numbers. The interesting thing, of course, is that Malta has is the only other country in the world that uses the same electoral system to elect its members of Parliament to their national chamber. And we can kind of consider whether that might be significant or not. A lot of people look at this and they get very depressed. And, if you look at the Interparliamentary Union ranking of countries, Ireland is, and Tom touched on it, 90th in the world. I'm a little less kind of worried about it. Rwanda ranks the best, but let's be honest, you'd rather be a woman in Ireland than Rwanda and many of the countries that Tom mentioned. And a lot of the reason that many of them have such high numbers in recent years is because of gender quotas. And of course, of 17 of the top 20 countries in the world in terms of women's representation, high numbers in Parliament, do have gender quotas, and we're going to introduce our own ones from the 2012 Electoral Reform Act at the next, kind of a mild version of gender quotas at the next general elections in the Republic of Ireland. So this may have an impact and raise us up the ranks. But it's not ideal, you know, but it's not the end of the world either. The state of play at the moment, and this is kind of the number of female candidates elected in Ireland since kind of in the I'll use post-war, not that we were in the war, but anyway, period. Pretty grim in the 40s and 50s. You know, we'd have 2 or 3 female candidates, and typically they were related to a former member of the Dáil, that kind of dynastic element, which still actually does account for a largish number of women who are elected to the Dáil. Then we see this kind of gradual, you know, not so gradual, actually kind of steep increase. We have this kind of glory period in the 1990s, and we would have expected it to linearly increase. But it hasn't. It seems to have plateaued. And there's a divergence here between the number of candidates and the number of elected women in terms of percentages in kind of the 1990s and forward. And in part this is because the smaller parties start nominating a lot more women. But of course they're smaller parties, they don't get so many candidates elected. So in the last election, you know, Labour Party, Ivana can wave her hand, had 25% of its candidates were females, whereas Fianna Fáil only had 13%, and Fine Gael 15%. And of course they do typically, perhaps not the last election for Fianna Fáil, they do typically elect more candidates, and this is a problem. It may not be discrimination though, it's that they have more candidates in the Dáil, and as I'll show you, the best way to get elected is to be an incumbent. And no party, you know, should commit electoral suicide by deselecting incumbents to place women on the ticket, and so on and so forth. But it is puzzling, okay? There's very low levels of female representation in Ireland, despite having a proportional representation system, which the political science literature has conclusively demonstrated is very conducive to the election of women. Now do bear in mind that the Irish form of PR is quite peculiar. We only share it with Malta. It's not like the German system. We'll discuss that in some more detail. Ireland has changed a great deal in the last 30 or 40 years. We've relatively high rates of labour force participation. We've had incredible cultural change, but we haven't seen this kind of concomitant rise in the number of women elected to Parliament. And interestingly, you know, we talk about it being 90th in terms of representation in the Interparliamentary Union ranking of women in Parliament. We're 5th best for the World Economic Forum in terms of gender parity between men and women in the world. We're right up there with the countries we want to emulate. Number 1 is Iceland, number 2 is Finland. Finland displaced Norway last year. I know the Norwegians are up to. Norwegians are 3rd. Sweden is 4th, and Ireland is 5th. We're even ahead of the Danes. So this is in terms of parity. New Zealand is, I think, 6th. This is in terms of parity, in terms of economic performance, kind of economic participation, education, health, and kind of the political dimension. So in some senses, it's quite puzzling. You know, life as a woman in Ireland is better than many other countries across the world. Okay, so we're going to look at that from a whole variety of aspects. So why so low? I'm going to give you a lot of data, and you can take what you want from it. But I've used over the last 4 or 5 years a whole variety of data to kind of approach this puzzle. So I've used aggregate data just looking at the number of candidates who were elected in each election, 2002, 2007, 2011. I've also used the Irish National Election Study, which I'm involved in. This is where we ask citizens, 1,800, 2,000 citizens randomly chosen, a whole kind of battery of questions about the election, the campaign, and kind of their ideological views. I've also run in 2007 and 2011 candidate studies where we ask the people who ran, the 465 or the 567 in the 2011 election, ask them kind of similar set of questions to kind of get their perspective on the question, and a whole bunch of other things obviously as well. The women questions are kind of just, you know, kind of slipped in there. And what I'm doing at the moment is a survey of Irish professionals, which kind of arose from my kind of puzzlement from the kind of 3 previous elements of data. So, aggregate data. So this is where we just look at the number of, you know, we get the names of all of the candidates who ran at each election. And there's 13 to 25% of candidates in these elections were women for each of the parties. In 2007, 2011, each district had at least, 38 of the 43 districts had at least 1 woman candidate. It's a bit grim that they're all male slates still when you have 15 or 20 candidates running in districts, but that's what it is. Gathered data on spending, which is public in Ireland. Campaign experience, had they run before? The gender, obviously, the question we're interested in. Incumbency, whether they're sitting TDs, and things like whether they had been in a minister, whether they had county council experience, and so forward, so on and so forth. And what we looked at was, can we see, do women get fewer first preferences than men? And the specification is actually the deviation from the mean candidates' first preference votes in the district. Just think of it in terms of actual votes that they got. It has to be specified in a specific way. And so we run some statistical analysis on this. And what we find, this is, if it's not for the statistically minded, the thing to bear in mind here is these are positive impacts on getting votes, and the ones to the left side of this dashed line are negative. However, if the error bars, those are the things kind of hanging out at the sides, if they cross over that dashed line, there's no statistical significance for that particular variable. So what we find, gender does cross, this is a 95% error bar. The gender is not significant. It is a negative coefficient, it is kind of a negative impact, but it's not statistically significant from kind of 0. What we do find, the big things that matter, and not surprisingly, the thing that matters the most is incumbency. The surest way of getting elected in the Republic of Ireland is already to have a seat, even in 2011, where all those Fianna Fáilers lost their seats. Being a minister, and of course this could be name recognition or bringing pork, kind of bringing goodies to your district, and money. Money, there isn't a lot of money in Irish politics, but it does buy you votes. One of my colleagues, two of my colleagues did a study, and every €3 spent gets you an extra vote. When it comes down to 5 or 6 votes at the end in some constituencies, it might be worth spending that extra €20. Okay, experience matters a little bit. It's just barely statistically significant, but not as much as you would expect. And a lot of it's caught in, I guess, incumbency and ministry experience. So the bottom line here is that there really is, even when we remove those controls, there is no impact of gender on the number of votes you get. It's not statistically significant. What matters most is having money and being an incumbent or being a minister. Okay? And in fact, when you kind of remove incumbents and you kind of run the analysis separately on incumbents and non-incumbents, gender still doesn't matter. It's quite extraordinary. So then we look at the Irish National Election Study. So this is the study where we ask citizens randomly chosen what they think about politics. And we're trying to identify here, are there, maybe gender doesn't matter, but maybe, it's all kind of coming out in the wash, and there are certain types of voters who vote for women and certain types of voters that vote for men. So are there particular types of voters more likely to vote for women candidates? Can we identify, kind of people who are particularly biased, either for them or against them? And this was, we've run this on 3 different Irish national election studies. And so what we do is we take the candidates, then we kind of run an analysis taking into account the gender of the voter, the respondent in this case, whether, the ideological views of the voter, and then control for things like education. Are more educated people more likely to vote for women? Their political knowledge, their age. We threw in a question in the last election study. It was very interesting. I wasn't around for the very first Irish national election study, and there were no questions asked on attitudes to feminism. Feminist voter, that's, do you believe in, having more women in Parliament, and how party-centred. In Ireland, obviously, some people are candidate-centred rather than party-centred. And I won't show you the table, but basically the bottom line is no matter what we do, we can't find voter bias. There's no evidence that women candidates do worse than men. There's no evidence that gender is a significant voting cue for either men or women. The gender of the candidate just doesn't seem to matter to the voter. What does matter is the party of the candidate, which one might expect, particularly for party-centred voters. That's by far the most important cue. So, you can put up a male or a female. Fianna Fáil voters will vote for him or her. They don't really care about the sex of the candidate. We did find that there is and this is kind of a conventional wisdom, the women won't vote for women. What we did find, we ran the analysis on both votes from mock ballots in the national election study, and we also, there's a question in there that asks how warmly you feel about candidates. So on a scale of 0 to 100, how do you feel about Enda Kenny? Are you a 10 or are you a 90? We did find that women voters were, and particularly those who kind of had kind of feminist leanings, they felt warmer towards female candidates, but this did not translate into giving them high preference votes, or and so it didn't really seem to matter. That was the only sort of gendered aspect we found in the national election study. So what do voters want? If you can put your mind back to the last Irish election. It's kind of hard to remember, it's 2 years ago, but there was a whole narrative of the campaign was about reform, and there was, that was the talk of it. And so we did ask a series of questions about, what do you want the Dáil to look like? So there was this notion that it was kind of an old boys network, and it was, full of constituency-oriented individuals, and that they weren't policy-minded, and so on and so forth. And so these are just descriptive statistics, but do you believe the Dáil should have more or less of the following? Young TDs. That was the thing that most people, on average. Now, this is aggregate, so it's average, but it's a scale a lot less to a lot more. Young TDs and female TDs were seen to be by far the most important. Well, I guess TDs who live in the area, so much for the national focus. It's kind of hard to think of TDs who don't live in the area in Ireland, but anyway, there's still that localism element, and that actually came out, incidentally, the whole way throughout the national election study. Despite the fact that the narrative of the campaign was about more national focus, people wanted, in fact, their TDs to spend more time in their constituencies. Working class TDs, so they wanted a kind of more variety and diversity. They did not want more older people, basically. They were okay, they're about the same as now with Christian TDs and gay and lesbian TDs. So as a general good, people thought having younger and more women in the Dáil really mattered, but then you ask them, what do you want in your local TD? How important is it that your TD shares, on a scale again from not at all important to very important, these features? What's really astonishing is Irish people don't even seem to care so much if they share the same political viewpoint. That's, they're so about that. It is a little odd. Now, you can control for things, and that does matter to people with left-wing leanings a little bit more, but it does seem to kind of pan out in the wash. Same area comes again. This sort of localism is just comes to the fore all the time in Irish politics. Same social class. People, they don't care. The thing they care least about is the same sex. So more women is a good thing, as a general good, but I don't care if my own member of parliament is the same sex as me. And this fits with kind of the earlier findings that we touched on. So what do the candidates themselves think? So this is from the Comparative candidate study. These studies are run all across Europe and in fact beyond, and I run the Irish one. And so we asked the candidates to try and kind of get a grasp, of what's going on here. So this is another kind of source of data. And there's a whole battery of questions here. I've only picked 2 out of them. So these are female candidates and male candidates, nicely color-coded, although I think they've become red and blue. But anyway, the blue is male. Why are there so few women in the Dáil? Okay, and Irish politics is too conflictual. Female candidates, so these are the people who've actually decided to run, and some of them are elected. We got about a 45% response rate, which is actually rather good by international standards. The Scandinavians get better, but the British candidate study only got about, after trying much harder and having a great deal more money than we did, only got about 20-25% response. So there's a disparity here between male and female candidates. Male candidates don't think it's too conflictual. And this is what really kind of fascinated me. Women lack confidence. Now, male candidates do not think that's a problem at all, 10%, whereas a majority of female candidates think this is really a significant source of problems. And bear in mind, these are the women who had the confidence to run. They're quite exceptional. And so I hadn't given much thought to this, but this emerged a lot in the 2007 and the 2000. I was really kind of shocked by the difference. There's no differences in terms of, women aren't suited for political life and all that. Nobody agrees with that sort of thing. But this was the one that fascinated me. So I kind of wanted to explore that a little more. But just before I get onto that, I thought I'd draw your attention to this. Things would improve with more women. Male candidates they're not really convinced of that. It's about 30% of female candidates. There's still this gender difference between voters, but it's less. Voters are jaded and cynical. They were especially. Remember how angry people were in the 2011 campaign. But female voters still think it would be better off in a slight majority than male, but there's huge difference. It may be about self-preservation. Candidates getting worried. This flood of females running and displacing them at the next election. But anyway, what I'm saying is I wanted to kind of explore this decision to run and this lack of confidence. And so to do this, and this is what I'm doing at the moment, the Irish Research Council, I have to thank them for paying for it. What I'm looking at is why citizens, and not just women, but why people rule themselves out of the political game, okay? So I'm studying people, it's kind of the pool of potential candidates rather than those who actually run. So I've identified kind of the profile of people who are likely to run for office. Now, the way I've done that is looking at Irish professionals from the sorts of backgrounds that TDs typically come from increasingly. And so I want to understand their perceptions of political life, and also, what they, their ideological background, and to a little bit explore their personality. So there's a whole section on kind of standard psychology, battery of questions about risk averseness, and so on and so forth. So it's a survey of 2,400 Irish professionals. It's ongoing. There's still surveys in the field. And I should say there's a health warning here. This is the very first cut at this data, and it's not all of the data. I have master's students and PhD students inputting it for me. I had to do it in hard copy, because the way I did it was I wanted a perfect random sample. So the first couple of months were spent scraping lists off the web to get a complete database of Irish doctors and Irish lawyers and Irish teachers and so on and so forth. Not easy. It's odd though, you find odd things out. There is not a list of general practitioners in Ireland to be had anywhere, so you end up doing all sorts of crazy things. So doctors, dentists, lawyers, barristers, school principals, accountants. Accountants move a lot. They've left their jobs. There's a high mobility. You learn all sorts of kind of peculiar things along the way. Business leaders and political activists. These people tend to be highly educated, and they're kind of senior barristers and school principals. They're people who are very accomplished and have the skills that you would expect, to kind of lead them to be successful politicians. And so it's a very peculiar study, half men, half women, so to kind of get the comparison. And we look at things like their political attitudes, ideologies, standard battery of questions, because they will be control variables in future studies. Outlook on life. This is kind of, I've drawn a lot on psychology, behavioral psychology, and behavioral economics here to kind of try and capture people's predispositions. Also perceptions of political life. Irish politicians get a hard deal, and there's a lot of negativity towards it, and I wanted to kind of tap this, and also the standard demographics. I'm just going to give you kind of an overview of a couple of things that have come out so far. But again, with the health warning, this is only a fraction of the sample. Are you qualified to run for office? Okay, so remember, these are highly educated men and women. Very qualified. A third of men think they're very qualified, whereas 1 in 5 women. But I'm really, qualified and somewhat qualified, exactly the same percentages, but I'm really concerned about this. Almost 1 in 4 highly educated professional women think they are not at all qualified to run for office, whereas less than 1 in 10 men would describe themselves that way. And they're ruling themselves out. It's this confidence issue, and I find this alarming. This is also, there's similar work, only other places done is the US, and they find exactly the same sort of thing. Negative feelings towards aspects of the modern campaign. Okay, so in Ireland you have to go door to door, and so the question here is, how do you feel about this? And this is the percentage of people who said negative, or so negative that it would deter them from running. There aren't huge differences in the door-to-door thing. So, some people, I personally wouldn't like to go around knocking on strangers' doors. That's fine. And what we're interested in is kind of the gender differences. Dealing with the media. Irish people are pretty social. These aren't too bad. Soliciting donations. Neither men or women are comfortable with this. We don't like discussing money in Ireland. You don't need a lot of money, but that's uncomfortable. This is this again hits at the gender differences. Enduring a negative campaign. And campaigns aren't so negative in Ireland, but they're increasingly negative with social media and kind of scurrilous rumours on the web. And this is a huge difference. Women don't like this kind of the nasty element, perhaps, of campaigns, or what they perceive to be kind of the nasty element of it. Willingness to take risks. So there's a lot of work done in behavioral economics and psychology that they find that women, for whatever reasons, I don't explore this here, but it might be cultural, it might be biological. Women are more risk averse than men. Okay, and they're less likely to put themselves forward for high-paying jobs for which they're qualified because they don't think they're ready. They're less likely to take financial risks, which is not a bad thing. We wouldn't be in the situation we are now had we had more women down the IFSC or in banks. So risk averseness is not a negative thing, okay? But what we find is, this medium risk. Men are more likely to and there's a whole series of questions, and I scaled them, and they kind of fit together. Things like, I like to take risks, I like to compete with others, rejection doesn't bother me, and so on and so forth. And men are again, slightly, it's not a huge difference, but again, men are more likely to characterize themselves as risk-taking. And the thing to bear in mind here is that the single transferable vote it exposes you a great deal. You're competing with other members of your party, you're competing against candidates in a way that you don't have to compete if you're running on a closed list in Germany. You have to compete to get the position on the list, but it's not as public. And so there may be something about STV perhaps that makes it, particularly unattractive to the risk averse. Price of public life is too high. Now, what's worrying here is not the gender difference, it's that pretty much, a majority of the professionals think the price of public life is too high. Women think of it nearly 70% of women think the price of public life is too high, but a majority of men also. And so there's this very, very strong negative perception of political life. And the media perhaps don't help with that, but Ivana will be able to speak to that some more, I'm sure. I want to end on a more positive note, though. Okay, so how closely do you follow politics? And the thing is, there are some gender differences. Men say very closely and women closely, but a large majority of women follow politics closely. They're interested. They're out there, potentially, if they can be convinced that you don't have to be, a superwoman to be qualified to run for office. So, they are interested, and they are there to be recruited by the parties at the next election when they have to find 30% of them to run. And just on a very frivolous note, because there's a whole battery of psychology questions asked in there, I thought I'd end with one, which I will use in subsequent analysis, isn't it? On how happy were you yesterday? So this is a very good question for capturing kind of people's personality disposition, rather than asking them how happy they are now, how happy were you yesterday? And on the whole, we're a happy lot, we're a happy lot of professionals, 8, 9, 10, so we're way up there on the scale, and women are even happier than men, so it's not all a bad story. Okay, thank you. Okay, yeah.
I could just stand here and respond to all of that of Gail's because there's so much in it, but I will, rather than doing that, I will come here and say what I had intended to say. I was elected as, I think was touched on in the introduction in 2001 when I was 26. At that time, I was the youngest woman ever to have been elected to Parliament in the state of Queensland. And I was one of a very small number of young women in politics across Australia. I now see, creating a path because there wasn't one to be followed. But I see that to a greater extent in retrospect than I have to say I was particularly aware of it at the time. Given that I was, by my very nature, unusual, people often asked me why I did it, and indeed it was a question I often asked myself. Philosophically, I believe absolutely that the world can be improved and that politics is the best and the most direct way to do it. Practically, my party was quite serious at the time, and indeed still is, about women's representation. I was a Labor MP in Queensland. The Australian Labor Party instituted its own internal system of quotas through the 1990s, and our leader at a state level at the time was a man, but was very serious about encouraging more women into politics. On a personal level, and this touches to some of the confidence stuff that Gail was talking about, I come from a long line of very strong women. I'd had a good education at quite an elite private girls' school, and my parents were, or are, progressive people and feminists. So I was very actively brought up with the idea that, of course, I could do anything at all. And I entered politics with that idea or that foundation as well. So when I look back on it, I have a sense that I entered politics, frankly, out of a bit of naivety. It didn't occur to me that there would be any reason why I couldn't do this. People looking on described this decision to go into politics to me as being courageous. At the time, I don't think it was. At the time, I think it was, frankly, as naive as it was courageous. But I have no doubt that it then took some courage to see it through, because while I might have been oblivious to them, of course there are a million barriers and there are a million reasons why young women don't do this. From the outside, the sort of public view of my career went like this. I spent 8 very long years on the backbench, feeling frankly invisible. I had that experience that women have of feeling invisible in meetings where you say something and it's as if you didn't speak at all. I felt invisible in the chain of promotion. I felt that there were complete idiots being promoted around me, and I felt as if I almost did not exist. And looking back on it, I found that a tremendously difficult time, and I don't know really how. It was just pure patience that got me through it. Things began to change for me in 2007 when our party leadership was taken over by a woman called Anna Bligh. And she became Queensland, which is not traditionally seen as the world's most progressive place. She became Queensland's first ever female premier. I'd been a supporter of Anna's for many, many years, even before I was in Parliament, and she had some faith in me. So at that point, my star began to rise. I immediately became a parliamentary secretary, and in 2009, after Anna won her first election in her own right, because the transition had happened mid-term, I became a minister and went immediately to the quite senior position of Minister for Transport. About 3 months after I'd become Transport Minister in this new cabinet, the government decided to take on a very ambitious program of asset sales. We sold 2 ports and a railway for about, in US dollar terms, about $10 billion. And they were, of course, all within my portfolio when I was a brand new minister. So that was, quite frankly, just a tremendously difficult, it was a big learning curve and a hard thing to do. The resistance to asset sales was absolutely enormous and fierce. And I noted Gail talked about this view that Irish politics is tough, which I find frankly amusing, because Irish politics, I'm sure, is tough looking from here, but Australian politics is a much tougher and more robust game than is Irish politics. The unions, particularly the very blokey Electrical Trades Union, went absolutely nuts about our asset sales. Right across my electorate there were billboards that said Rachel Nolan sold us out, and next to those big letters in red were pictures of angry, quite overweight older men with their arms crossed across their chests. I had a lunatic independent candidate who put up handwritten signs around my electorate for months and months and months that said Rachel Nolan lied, and the blokes on the Ipswich City Council, who'd never liked me anyway, refused to impose their own bylaws and take those signs down. The Premier, Anna, had been very popular, but became on this decision enormously unpopular, with polling showing that people didn't like her and didn't trust her. The government got asset sales done, something of which I am enormously satisfied, but we subsequently got completely flogged. We were a Labor government. We went from having 51 seats in the Parliament to having 7. And when we got quite so comprehensively flogged, the Parliament in Queensland went from having 38% women, which was one of the highest levels in the world. It had previously been 45 under us. There were 50% women in the Labor caucus. The government that took over from us had far fewer women, and so women's representation in the Parliament went to 17%. And this change in the public debate went essentially unremarked. So that's the outside show of my, I guess, difficult but frankly tremendously fulfilling political career. But my topic here is what it's like on the inside, and I think to address the question of what it's really like, I need to tell you about the personal journey as well. Otherwise, I will only be giving you half of the story. two things happened to me that were unique to the experience of being in politics and being a woman. The first was that early on in politics, I broke up with a fellow, my previous boyfriend, who took it upon himself then to seek to harass me from my position. Over 8 years, he wrote nasty personal letters about me to everyone he could think of in politics, the media, my colleagues, my mentor, everyone who was around. And you could say, well, that's just a thing that happens in politics, but there were two senses in which it wasn't. One was that the allegations that he made about me were the kind of nasty things you say about women, but you don't say about men. I won't go into it. But the other thing that was, I guess, unique about it, I think, was his feeling that he had a right, that I wasn't entirely legitimate in my position, and therefore he had a right to seek to harass me out of it. The other thing that happened in the time that I was in politics was that one of my very best friends didn't cope well when I became a minister with my apparent, I'll put this in inverted commas, with my apparent success. And so she, after 25 years of friendship, picked a fight about a matter of government policy, but subsequently basically abandoned me as a friend. She did that really because my success made her feel bad about herself. And so she found herself emotionally unable to continue the friendship. Again, you could say that's just something that happens, but the women in the room will know that girls, from when you're in primary school all the way through to adulthood, do behave in that way sometimes. It's not something, men don't treat each other in similar ways. So those imbalances don't play out between men in the same way as they do between women. So both of those things were frankly people in my own life struggling to see my position, or more to the point, my power, as being legitimate and feeling in a way that they had to take it on. My nasty personal experiences are symptomatic of a broader and empirically measurable social trend. In the book Lean In, which I would recommend to you, Sheryl Sandberg quotes empirical research that shows an inverse relationship between power and likability for women. That is, the more powerful women are, the less people tend to like them. This does not apply to men. What I saw in my personal life, as I touched on, but also publicly, was that people viewed women as being less likeable as they took on more power. As Deputy Premier, Anna Bligh, my leader, was a hugely popular political figure. When she became Premier, naturally, she did not, as a person, change. But the polls very quickly began to show that people felt that they did not really know her. They did not like her, and so as a result, they threw her out. This might seem shocking, and the people who said those things would justify it in terms of, we didn't think she was going to make those decisions. But of course, leaders make hard decisions all the time, and you don't see the same dramatic turnaround in the extent to which people feel warm about them or the extent to which people like them. As I said, this happens all the time. Hillary Clinton, Julia Gillard, who's the current female Australian Prime Minister, even Mary Harney, who has been the most successful woman ever in Irish politics, are seen as divisive political figures when everyone who knows them says that they are warm, engaging and decent people. Right now in the Western world, I see no model at all where women can simply be legitimate political leaders, where they can be judged not by emotion, but simply on how well they're doing their job. We of course have had significant political women leaders. People like Margaret Thatcher and Angela Merkel get by, but they do it through a clear model of being uber tough. I genuinely can't think of a political leader, an elected one in a parliamentary system, not the sort of pseudo-politics of Irish presidential campaigns, or for instance, not someone like Christine Lagarde, who's appointed to that position, not elected. I can't think of a parliamentary leader who has been, in the Western world, who has been feminine and powerful on the world stage at the same time. While people continue to hold these biases against women, such as the likability gap, it will remain impossible for women leaders simply to be accepted as leaders and for who they are. There's a Gandhi quote that I held dear and very much love. The Mahatma said, "First they ignore you, then they laugh at you, then they fight you, then you win." I'll leave winning out of this in my own case because while we lost, I feel a tremendous sense of satisfaction with the things that we did. So I don't quite see it as the outright loss that indeed on paper it most certainly is. But the other three stages I and women have most certainly gone through. For me, I spent 8 years being ignored on the backbench and feeling invisible. I was ridiculed. Even quite recently, a columnist in our local Murdoch paper in Brisbane described me as, and I quote, the gloriously dizzy Rachel Nolan. There are lots of things that I am, but I'm not dizzy. And our opponents, in my electorate, the government's opponents, but in my electorate, a couple of cohorts of women in particular, through to blokes in the union movement and the Conservative opposition, fought the election in which we were defeated incredibly hard. We didn't just lose, we were comprehensively taken down, and the campaign had a particularly nasty tone to it. In Australia, women are being fought now. Our first female Prime Minister has an election coming up in September and she is under huge attack. A well-known Australian radio commentator recently said, and I quote, that women are wrecking the joint. Protesters in Canberra have held placards which have said, "Ditch the witch," in description of that Australian Prime Minister, and our opposition leader, who is on the record saying that he doesn't think a lack of women in power is a problem, has stood next to those protesters while they held up those signs. One of Julia Gillard's biggest problems is that voters, including women, say they don't know her and they don't feel an emotional connection to her. That is that likability problem again. What's happening to Julia Gillard is sexist, it's distressing, and it's deeply wrong. At least in Australia, though, there's a fight. I've only been in Ireland since January, but on my observation, in Ireland right now, there are no really senior women at the very highest, the senior ministerial level of politics. There are very few female voices in the political debate, even when it comes to abortion. It seems to me that Australian women are being fought, but Irish women are being ignored. My time in politics was hard, but it was fantastic. The social changes that we made, the things that we did, selling the railway, I was able to protect some bushland, the changes we made will always stand. The friendship and the loyalty of my colleagues will last my whole life. The strength that I found on that journey makes me who I am. The question is, what do we have to do? If we accept that politics needs women, and I think it is a big deal, and that politics does, and if we accept on my experience that politics is good for women too, the question becomes, what do we have to do to make that happen? I see three things. First, Sexism is everywhere. Our social biases create a barrier, and so to women being in politics, and so both women and men need to call sexism when they see it all the time. Sexism is in all the households where work is not equally shared. It's in meetings where women are not heard. It's in schools where principals are men despite the vast majority of teachers being women. I assume that happens here, it certainly does in Australia. It's in the Catholic Church where the refusal to allow women priests makes it almost impossible to be a feminist and a Catholic at the same time. It's in the door, obviously. It's certainly in the Australian Parliament. It's in the reduced confidence and expectations of women, and it's in the obliviousness to it of men. I've told you some parts of my personal story, though I never spoke of it when I was in politics. Perhaps I should have though, because really I think we do need to call sexism everywhere we see it all the time. We could start, I think, with the prevalent attitude among young women today that feminism has nothing to do with them. I think that when young women say that, they betray the legacy which has been created by women who came before them, and they sell down the river their daughters who may not yet have even been born. These attitudes, that feminism is not relevant today, are naive, they are lightweight, they are irresponsible, and they are dumb. We should expect more of girls, and we should expect more of boys too. Secondly, women and men need to stand up for change. In Ireland right now, the wonderful thing, in my view, is that quotas are being forced upon the country. I've had a bit to do with Irish politics in the time that I've been here. I observe that Fianna Fáil seem to be much more onto the potential created by quotas than do Fine Gael. There's a terrific organisation in Ireland right now called Women for Election, which is training potential women candidates, but as importantly, it's building networks of supporters who'll get out there and work for those women. This organisation is represented tonight by Michelle O'Donnell-Keating. These people are worthy of support. In every election, the voters and the media should ask candidates, do you think the absence of women is a problem? And what are you going to do about it? And thirdly, we need to support those women who do stand up. Sometimes that will mean confronting our own personal biases, of which we may be quite blissfully unaware. We need to back other women, even when their achievements make us reflect negatively upon our own. Next time we're tempted to say that the boss is bitch, or we just don't like a woman leader, without really being able to articulate what it is that she's done wrong, perhaps we need to ask ourselves how our own personal biases are playing in. The women who do stand up show courage, and so if this is a social change to which we are committed, it is incumbent on us, all of us, men and women, it is our responsibility to back them in. In Australia, with Julia Gillard under attack, and in Ireland with quotas on foot, we stand at moments of opportunity. Moments of opportunity which might not, for a very long time, come again. As I said at the outset, I believe, and I've always believed, that it is through politics that we make change. Now is a very good time in Australia and here in Ireland to seize that day.
Okay, well, first of all, just like to thank the organisers for inviting me to speak and to give a response, a short response. It'll just take 10 minutes to respond to the fascinating presentations from Gail and from Rachel, and it was really instructive and informative to listen to you both. I suppose I'm somebody who's been in electoral politics since 2007. I was elected first to the Seanad in 2007 as an independent, was in opposition for some years, went into the Labour group in the Seanad and was re-elected in 2011, and I'm now leader of the Labour group in the Seanad and deputy leader of the Seanad because we're now on the government side, so it's been an interesting journey. I think Gail's presentation certainly, and I should say Gail gave a wonderful presentation to the Constitutional Convention as well. So I know I'm familiar with some of her work, but I think it's hugely important in that it nails the myth about women not voting for other women, because that is something, as you say, that is out there in the ether and that we always hear. And I think her other material, I must say, on localism, I find fascinating as somebody who has gone door to door and who knows just how much Irish voters place a store on localism. Because I was somebody who was trying to be a TD in a constituency I didn't live in, and it didn't work. So that was very instructive. And the political issue, the research on the political ambition or confidence gap, clearly that's hugely important and more needs to be done. I'm conscious when you talk about risk aversity, about the old joke about if the Lehman brothers had been the Lehman sisters, it would have been a very different sort of economic cycle we'd be in. Rachel's comments, I think, on a personal level, were extremely interesting. And I know a little about Australian politics, and certainly it does appear that there's perhaps more overt or robust sexism, as you've said. On the other hand, there's also more women active at a higher level in Australian politics, which to me points at a paradox, that Irish politics may not be quite as overtly macho, or that's certainly the impression I get, or as overtly tough. But then if you've ever been at a Labour Party or indeed any other party internal selection convention, you'll know just how robust or tough Irish politics can be. And certainly there's a very particular feature of our political system, which is the fact that you are competing not only against candidates from other parties in a constituency, but indeed usually most fiercely against candidates from your own party or potential candidates from your own party in a constituency. So that makes Irish politics particularly robust, albeit in a slightly different way, I think. A lot of it goes on behind closed doors. That's a very tough fight. But certainly your comments, I think, on the likeability gap are extremely interesting, although I'm not sure they apply just to women. I was thinking about this as you were speaking, and certainly we've had, I think, some interesting experiences here with the dramatic decrease in likeability of my own party leader since he gained power, and the converse extreme increase in likeability as measured by popularity polls of the Taoiseach, who was extremely unlikable apparently if you looked at opinion polls before he was elected. So Enda Kenny's likeability ratings are interesting to look at, I think. And in terms of senior women in politics, well, I do think Joan Burton perhaps bucks the trend of likeability that you've talked about in the sense that her popularity certainly appears to be still steady. You also mentioned about the quotas and Fianna Fáil, and of course Fianna Fáil have an opportunity that the other parties don't with the quotas, with the introduction of quotas, because they have far fewer incumbents, and therefore they are in a position to be taking on many more new women, and I know their party leader is very conscious of that and is really moving that on. I suppose just to talk a little bit then about the Irish system and about quotas as we have them in Ireland. Gail and Tom both mentioned the IPU rankings, and while the rankings, as Gail has said, are interesting in the sense that they mask the countries that are at the top, like Rwanda, that have just fixed quotas where you must elect a certain number of women to parliament. But Sweden is second; they don't have that sort of quota. They genuinely have a much more bottom-up system which ensures greater gender equality. But at the same time, what's interesting about the rankings for us, I think, is not so much the absolute figures as the drop that we've experienced. That in 1990, we were 37th in the world rankings, quite a respectable position, around the same as Belgium and Spain. But Mary Robinson had just been elected as president, and there did seem to be an increase in the numbers of women entering politics in Ireland. But 23 years on, we dropped to 85th position, around 85, 90 position we're hovering, as you've heard, with barely a perceptible increase in the numbers of women actually in the Dáil. 26 now, following Helen McEntie's election and the by-election, 26 out of 166, which means our parliament has always been at least 85% male, so it's an extraordinarily poor record. And what's worst about it is that other countries have improved. Belgium and Spain, who are around the same as us, are now up in the top 20, or indeed even in the top 10, because they've partly because they've introduced the sort of quotas that we have now introduced. And I should mention Yvonne Gallagher is also in the audience, Professor Yvonne Gallagher, who was a huge influence on me, certainly, in trying to research this. And when I was first elected in 2007, being so conscious of so few women in the Dáil and Seanad, we set up a subcommittee on women's participation in politics, produced a report in 2009 on women's participation, and drawing on research by Yvonne and Fiona Buckley and others, we talked about the 5 C's, these obstacles that are presented to women in entering politics, and the difficulties with childcare, with confidence, with lack of cash, with the culture in politics that is very inimical to women, but finally with candidate selection procedures, the 5th C, that is the most easy to tackle through legislation. The others clearly require long-term measures. They require measures like mentoring systems within parties, like funds to be set up and fundraising methods, like better policies on childcare, and all, advertising campaigns that tackle stereotypes and so on. But the candidate selection issue, we felt, here's something we can hone in on. Here's something that other countries have clearly have taken steps on, positive action steps, and they appear to have made a difference. So we suggested that there would be a sort of what we call a limited quota, an opportunity quota built into our legislation, and I'm glad to say that did. That recommendation was then taken up in the programme for government, and this is now, as Gail has said, part of the law. We passed it last year, section 42 of the Electoral Amendment Political Funding Act 2012. It's buried in an act that's actually about political funding generally, but it's quite appropriate because actually what it does is it states that state funding of each political party will be reduced by 50%, enormous slash, cut of half your budget, unless they select at least 30% of their candidates of each gender at the next general election, probably 2016. So that's a dramatic requirement on political parties. It is something that I think will make a sea change in the next election, because if you look at the overall number of candidates, I think I'm right in saying in 2011 the number of women candidates overall was 15%, and 15% of the TDs elected were women. If we see 30% of the candidates offered by political parties, which make up the majority of candidates elected, if we see 30% of those as women, even notwithstanding the fact that we will undoubtedly have women added just for the sake of it, we'll have what are often rather horribly referred to as token women on the ticket, we will still see, I think, an increase in the numbers of women actually elected. We may not get 30% elected because it is a matter for voters, but I think it will make a significant increase. And I think that groups like Women for Election, Michelle and Neil's group, which has been very, very active on the ground, and groups like the 50-50 by 2020 campaign, which has also been very active in trying to just promote the idea of women running for election and encourage more women to come forward. These are hugely important in changing the culture that we've had that we've had for so long, for all sorts of reasons, including the reasons that Gail is investigating. The reasons that mean that despite having less overt or robust sexism as we find in Australia, we still have much fewer women in high places in politics. So I suppose I want to just finish, as the others have done actually, on an optimistic note by saying I do think we're now on the cusp of change. I was one of the legislators who argued that we should have put a quota in place for the local elections next year, 2014, which are of course the next set of elections we'll face, locals and Europeans. But for lots of reasons, it was decided not to put that into the legislation, not least because state funding of political parties relies on the numbers of TDs elected, so it'd be hard to link it directly to councillors. So despite that disappointment, I'm very heartened that we see internally within all the parties, even the parties with a very high number of incumbents, we see really serious efforts being made to ensure more women are being brought forward for the locals next year, because they all know they must have 30% of candidates ready for the general election in 2016. And that's going to be a huge challenge for some of the bigger parties, not so much for Labour, for my own party, which has already been operating internal quotas and which tends to have a higher number of women candidates. But it will certainly, I think, make a huge change in Irish politics. I see a colleague of mine, Eileen Drew, in the audience, with whom I did research some years ago on women in the legal professions, and Eileen taught me a phrase which I love using, which is that it's not so much a glass ceiling that women face, it's a sticky floor. And we have to get off that sticky floor of politics. We have to challenge another of Eileen's phrases, the pipeline fallacy that suggests that women will just gradually trickle through, the system as more and more women become more educated and so on. And it hasn't happened. That trickle through should have happened. In my year in law in the mid-80s, we had nearly equal numbers of male and female students. Hasn't happened yet that we've seen the trickle up from that in the top levels of the legal profession. Hasn't happened in politics either. But it will. And if we have to take positive action steps like quotas to do it, then that's what we'll have to do. And I do think it will make a big change in the next election. Thank you very much.
Thank you very very much indeed. It was a really stimulating discussion, or we haven't got to the discussion yet, but a really interesting response to two wonderful papers. Would you be happy to take a few questions from the floor? Okay, hello.
Yes, thank you to all the speakers. Thank you. I'm Peter Simons, Head of Social Sciences and Philosophy at Trinity. This was very interesting. I'm interested in not so much in the means as the end. Assuming that women achieve something more like parity in politics, however long it takes, what are the benefits that will accrue to political and cultural life? What are the improvements, or what are the positives in policy and political culture that we can expect to accrue from having a greater proportion of women in politics? Because if we cannot see a clear way to those, it's going to be harder to persuade the electorate that they should vote for more women in politics.
Would you all like to take that?
I can start. Is it necessarily good? There's a research in political science that demonstrates that it doesn't radically change kind of policy outcomes, but women do tend to focus on different types of policy, and they tend to be, and this has been found in the US, they tend to be less partisan, and this is particularly important in the current climate in the US. So the women senators meet once a month and have dinner together across the Republican Democratic divide. That would be unheard of for their male counterparts. Now that may change, of course, if there was more of them. You know what I mean? So the dynamic, it's hard. There's so few countries with so many women elected that to see the effect. There are threshold effects, but when women reach about 30%, they tend to focus on issues like welfare and children's rights and human rights to a greater extent. And there is some suggestion that it's kind of some kinder, gentler democracy, perhaps. But, yeah.
Look,
You go. I will answer, but you go first.
I suppose just to say, I think having a representative democracy is a good in itself, and that's an aim to be aspired to. That if 50% of the population were of one ethnic group and they weren't represented, then that it'd be a very obvious problem. It's a very obvious problem if you don't have adequate representation of 51% of your population. So I think that's the first thing to say. It's not so much that the policies adopted might be any different, or the style of debate might be any different, but that your democracy would be more representative. That it currently isn't a finished or completed democracy, as I would see it, because we have such a below parity level of representation. I think also that, as Gail has said, the research shows if you reach 30%, that it becomes self-perpetuating. That in Denmark, for example, they were able to drop quotas. They were able to operate their sunset clause because they had achieved what has seemed to be a fairly consistent level. Now we actually have a 40% goal built into section 42, so it's not just 30% in the next election. 7 years on, that must raise to 40%. So it's quite an ambitious target, which I'm really happy about. But I think again we need to keep that in place to keep political parties working on it. And I think also that when we do see that sort of level of representation, we may well see a somewhat different style of debate and a somewhat different focus on policies. But I think it would take a critical mass before we can achieve that. But certainly I've seen, in my own limited experience, the Seanad has a greater number of women in it. We have 1/3 female representation in the Seanad, and partly because of the Taoiseach's nominees system. And this tends to be a more collegiate style of, and we can get cross-party consensus on issues in some ways more easily that way.
I think it's a human rights issue, and I think we've gone past the point where we should even have to answer the question. Nobody really is, well, I've never had anyone look at me and say, or indeed to a male colleague, and say, it's good that there are men almost exclusively running the show, or that there's any particular outcome which is achieved by that. So it seems to me quite simply to be self-evident that as a matter of human rights, while women are 50% of the population, they should be 50% of the decision makers, and I think we should accept that that is our starting point and make it incumbent upon anyone who thinks otherwise to go and argue their case. And I'd be more than willing to debate them on the matter. So that's my starting point, but seeing as you asked. The best anecdote on this, you've had two answers which are good answers, but of course in their nature are quite general. This is actually a really difficult thing to bed down. The best anecdote I ever heard on the topic was a woman called Meredith Bergman, who was a long-time member of the New South Wales Upper House, kind of a generation before me, so not someone I knew well. She was interviewed on TV when she retired, and she was asked this question, why does it matter? And what she said was this. She said, in all my years in the Parliament, I expected, and people expected, that women would vote differently on what we think of as women's issues. So, education, health, childcare, abortion law reform. But she said, of course, most of those things are ideological issues, at least the first three are, and abortion is a religious issue. She said, in all my time, the one thing on which I saw women across the chamber think differently and vote differently from men was on the question of gun law reform. But no one says that the regulation of firearms is a women's issue. And I think that's a really pertinent point. We don't know exactly where it is and how it is that a more balanced legislature would lead to different outcomes. It's fair for us to assume the answers which Gail and Ivana have given, that it will be a bit less partisan, it will be a bit more cooperative, it will have a bit more of a focus on social issues. As Christine Lagarde has said, we might not see the kind of high sort of testosterone-fueled financial madness of extreme risk-taking that tends to go with men on financial issues. But fundamentally, it's a human right, and it will change things across the board in myriad different ways at myriad different times. And that's why we should go down the path. Or more to the point, of course we should go down the path, and that's why we talk about how.
Oh, sorry. Perhaps afterwards then going to Michelle. Thank you. Sorry. I didn't see you. Sorry, forgive me.
Elaine Butler, I'm a member of the Green Party and toying with the idea of going for election in 2016. I was wondering, very much on the cusp. I was wondering whether you'd done much research into the local elections and the representation of women in local elections versus the general. Because my suspicion is that women are more drawn to local elections than they are the general election, and I'd be interested to know if that is the case and why it might be.
The figures of women elected at local elections are marginally better than the national election. Good experience, certainly, and the stakes of getting elected are probably lower, and that should be the recruitment path, perhaps. But it's really pretty miserable as well, but it's below 20%.
17%
currently.
So it's not much better?
No.
Okay.
But I mean, it just takes more women going for it.
Yes, Michelle. Sorry. Would you like the mic? Oh, thank you.
Hi, I just want to follow on from your comment there. I'm Michelle O'Donnell, Keating Eye from Women for Election. I'm also doing a PhD on the impact of liberal economic models on women. So one of the things that we find in Women for Election, it's the first question everybody asks is, what difference would more women make in politics? And we're like so blue in the face with it. But the thing is, we've brought it down to, we're following Ivana and Yvonne with their 5 C's, we've got 4 P's. So it's really easy to remember, so the next time anyone asks you, P, process, women do things differently, and this is all scientifically or empirically backed up with evidence. they approach things differently, be it on a constituency level, be it in a business sense, be it in any kind of, and you alluded to it there with your collaborative approach. So process is the first P. Priorities. Women tend to have different priorities. That could be because maybe they have children. That could be because they come from a different background, but they tend to have different priorities than men. The third one is because of the different process, the different approach, and the different priorities. It tends to lead to a different policy choice or a different policy outcome. Again, across the board. It's not necessarily always to do with caring or educational sectors. It goes across finance, it goes across transportation, as you probably would know. And the last one is access to power. And men would have traditionally had a very different access to power than women. Men would have had a very straight up access to power, whereas women tended to be belonging to a number of different organisations, not necessarily getting to the chair or the top position of each, but being part of a number of different organisations. So it's more of a kind of a zigzag approach. So all of those P's actually come to a fifth P, which is perspective, which is a different viewpoint. And this comes back to the question of really it's a case of a democratic position, but it really what we find is that actually bringing that subject or that answer to the four P's surrounded by the P of perspective brings a bit of clarity to that question that we're always asked, which is what difference more women will make, because as women we know we will make more difference, but we're always asked what difference do you think that you'll make. So I don't know if that helps that question.
Second row here, please. Thank you. Unless you would like to comment.
Maybe
or
come back to
come back to the question,
John O'Hagan, Economics. I thought it was a specific question, and it arises in a different context, and I've spoken to Gail about it a few times. It's getting females to run for the debates in college. And but one issue that struck me from that, the good news again was that we had all three speakers this year against Yale were females. But the issue that struck me though is you would have thought politics and broadcast current affairs commentators would be a similar lifestyle. And a majority of the top current affairs broadcasters in Ireland, that I understand, are females. So you might comment on that. Why they? And I was talking to one about that because it was in relation to the debate. Why did they not come forward to speak? And yet, I would have thought at least half our top 10 broadcasters are female at current affairs.
And I'm sorry, I can't see properly. Is there some? Sorry, third row.
Thank you. Bill from the law school as well here. I have a question for Rachel and Ivana, especially. What would be your advice for young women politicians? Thank you.
And two over here. And if we could perhaps wrap it up with these last two, with your
My question
response.
is really for Rachel. Whenever I go home lately and I watch the press, they refer to Julia as Julia. But as I grew up, I never heard the press refer to Bob, John, Paul. It was always Mr. Keating, Mr. Hawke, etc., etc. And I think I've thought about it on the back of your question about women doing current affairs, because we also have a lot of ladies doing current affairs. But they do. I think the language has an impact. So I just wonder if you've noticed that also.
I think we're writing it down.
Alison Hackett, an alumnus from Trinity here. Firstly, just on the first question about what difference will it make, I think that we just don't know the difference until we have men and women experience being governed by a balance of men and women. So we just have to get there, and then we'll begin to see the differences. My own daughter said to me recently she doesn't think anything will really change for feminism or for women until there are more female politicians, because the policies will then begin to change. But I had another comment, which is that I have become a letter writer to papers in the last couple of years, And the first time it took a little bit of courage, thought, you know, sticking my neck up, but just thought I don't want to end my life without having tried. And it took a little while to get in, but eventually I did. One of the things I initially did was I'd had a discussion with a male just at a party one night. We were talking about books you'd read, and we were exchanging the books we'd been reading recently, and he actually said, oh, I really like female writers that write like men. So I got very upset about this, and then with some of this letter writing, started writing as my name R.A. Hackett rather than giving away who I was, and I was kind of intrigued to know whether people thought the letter had come from a man or a woman, and sent him a text each time I get one in saying, you know, did you think that came from a man or a woman? But just to follow up on that, and more seriously, I've sent my letters to all the papers just as a way of getting them in, because if they wouldn't get into one, they sometimes get into another one. And the best ones did get into all three of the main broadsheets here, which is great. But if I do read the Irish Times every day, I express my bias there, but I have never once seen a majority of female writers to the paper. One of the letters I did get printed was actually about that, and the fact that on International Women's Day they didn't feature any female journalists on the main centre pages, and there was maybe one letter from a female. But this isn't the fault of men, this isn't the fault of the system. I think the fault is not enough women are writing letters. So my real question is, how do we turn around this grassroots level? And I can't blame the papers, I don't think they're getting the letters from the women. So if you could just at a very basic level get women to put their necks above the parapet and make their comment, and I think if more start doing it, more will start getting printed, and you'll start getting more balanced opinion.
Thank you. Could I ask the panel to comment on those questions if you can remember them? Or would you like me to read them down?
John, no, most of them are for you. So John's question on RTE, that's an interesting observation. It certainly is a problem for media across the world. I know the BBC are deeply concerned about it, and RTE. I think RTE is unusual though. I'm thinking of other countries, investigative journalists. I think about the Today programme, and it's not like Morning Ireland. There's John Humphreys and Jon Snow and Channel 4 and Jeremy Paxman. It's quite male actually, the BBC. So RTE either has consciously gone out of their way to recruit women. They do have problems getting women panellists though, and this comes back to the confidence. I personally don't like doing live radio, but the only way to do it is, to get better at it is to of course do it and actually, make a fool of yourself. No one remembers. The thing about the TV is they remember on the radio. Do it on the TV, because no one ever remembers what you say on the TV. It's like, what were you wearing? So if you want to get people's attention, of course, you should go on the radio. But I think it comes back to confidence, and I think the preponderance of women in RTE, I don't know, maybe our dean's spouse has a has a positive action plan, but I think RTE is unusual like that. It's not replicated in the United States, and it's not in Italy or Britain, as far as I know.
Look, I don't have much to add on the subject of RTE. Australia is somewhere in between. But there's certainly an identifiable issue in Australia of women as they get older getting dropped from TV, which is just the deepest outrage going around. But anyway, I'm really intrigued by this issue though, and I don't add anything to it, that you've got about student union politics, because that's not the case in Australia. I've heard that a number of times since I've been here. My experience of student union politics, not that I was very involved, but was that it was very much 50-50. So it's such an interesting PhD.
I was referring to debates.
Yeah. Sorry, excuse me getting it wrong.
Sorry.
Well, on the subject of debates, I just read this tremendous book which I referred to, Lean In, by a woman called Sheryl Sandberg, who is the Chief Operating Officer of Facebook. And she talks about her studies at Harvard. And in particular, in one of the chapters of this book, she gives some empirical research about the circumstances in which men and women will speak. And what she's talking about is that Harvard Business School lectures are really quite combative. And you kind of have to force your hand up and jump out of your skin to be heard. And what she talks about in the book is the way that teaching styles have been changed, and they tend to do things like more randomly selecting students to be heard rather than having to force themselves into the arena, as it were. But she actually, this would be interesting to you, I think. She talks about a number of changes they made within the business school, which led to higher levels of participation from women and ethnic minority groups, and that resulted in higher levels of overall satisfaction for all students. So I can't specifically remember it, but it was really interesting stuff.
I think that's. Oh, sorry.
Did I get the wrong way? Oh God, advice. Oh well, there are millions. Well, I was on the first question. Advice. My first advice is simply to do it. As I said, in my experience, you kind of do it out of, well, you know, sweet passion and, you know, hope, and then you work out how to do it. And there's something in that, I think. The issue of confidence, I think, is real. You struggle with thinking, I've got to do this and it's going to be tremendously hard and I'm going to get attacked and I'm going to feel like an idiot and people are going to say I'm an idiot. And all of that is going to happen. So beyond just do it and worry about it later, my next bit of advice is deeply understand about sexism so that you see what is coming towards you within a philosophical frame. When I spoke, you'll have gathered that there are all these things I took personally, and looking back, I see them as manifestations of sexism. And I wish someone had told me that at the time. And then the third thing is, because just understanding that intellectually won't be enough, is surround yourself with supporters and friends so that when you don't believe yourself that you're not an idiot, someone will tell you that actually you're okay.
Thank you.
That's 1 and 2. Now I've got Julia.
Do you want to go? No, you can.
All right, I'm doing the whole list. We're doing this in a chaotic way. I hadn't noticed about Julia, but it's true. And interestingly, I once worked for an opposition leader who became a chief minister, a woman called Claire Martin, in the Northern Territory, which is one of the roughest, toughest places on this earth. And she became the first woman to run that show up there. She used to sign her name on letters, Claire. And I at first thought that was lovely and that people would have a sense of warmth towards her. And I think it probably started out that way. But I think that in positions of power, whether it's headmaster, headmistress, or Mr. President, or Prime Minister, I think that an authority is maintained by maintaining the title. And looking back, I think that Claire Martin made a mistake and gave away some of her authority when she asked people to call her Claire. It's a mistake I made as a minister. Call me Rachel. And it's something that's happening to Julia Gillard, and that she'd just be well placed if she can to fight for. And letters. Well, I just think it's maintaining the rage. Yeah. There's nothing else for it. But as I said, us talking about these issues as if they do matter, and therefore empowering women to put their hands up.
Thank you very much. Sorry,
So just very briefly, I mean, John's point is absolutely right. The lack of women in debating societies in colleges, it was like that when I was a student. The Students' Union was a bit better, but I was only the second woman president after Anya Lawler of the Students' Union, so it's taken a while for women to be so active in the union as well. And I think RTE are now particularly good, and they weren't actually even a couple of years ago. It's just you've had a couple of really good women come forward in current affairs broadcasting. But as Gail has said, a lack of women on panels, and actually Lucy Keaveney has done some great work on just raising awareness in terms of the letter writing. I mean, as Rachel says, it's not just maintaining the rage, it's also keeping the awareness up and letting people know about it. I counted the letters in the Irish Times on abortion. They were almost 90% from men over a couple of days. And one day there was no letter from women on abortion. It was ridiculous. So, and I don't know if that is an editorial bias or if that, as you say, is there aren't enough women writing. But part of the issue is actually just putting it into people's minds. There aren't enough women coming forward to do these things. But I know in terms of women on TV panels, it is hard. There's very few of us in politics who are willing to do these shows. I get asked to do Vincent Brown all the time, and I know other women politicians do as well, and we just simply can't and won't because it's not healthy. It's not healthy for one's mental health. So that's a problem too, and so few of us were constantly on these things. Beelan's advice for young women. Well, I have 2 very small daughters, so I'm hoping by the time they're of an age to think about going into politics will have changed. I'll be able to say to them, I think it is a great career. I think at the moment, I think it's a pretty awful career, and but I do think more women should go for it. So don't be put off if you're thinking of running for the Green Party. I think the key thing is that women, my daughters and other young women, would have enough confidence to be able to contemplate going for it, and that, or whatever else they want to do. The issue of first names here, and I suppose we use first names all the time, and sometimes it's a measure of likability, like Bertie, in the good times he was Bertie to everyone in a good way, so that's a kind of hard one, but I see what you mean about if it's very marked where it's just women who are being referred to. And then finally the letter writers, just keep the rage up, keep writing.
If I could say, I think it's a really healthy sign that this room is filled, or nearly filled, on such a beautiful June evening. And I think that is a sign that the rage is continuing. I think feminism, sadly, is a very dirty word. And even for students in gender and women's studies, I find them saying, I'm not a feminist. I'm like, why? I just find this extraordinary. So I think that, the rage must continue. And I think we have had wonderful talks this evening, and thank you very much, and let's go out and elect more women.